A millionaire finds a little girl alone at the bus stop holding a sign that read, "I need a ride to Mom's hospital room." What he does next will leave you speechless. Her small fingers clutched a cardboard sign as the autumn wind whipped through her thin jacket, and when Albert's black Bentley pulled up to the curb, neither of them knew this moment would shatter everything they thought they knew about family, loss, and second chances. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The October air in downtown Chicago carried the scent of fallen leaves and exhaust fumes as Albert Richardson adjusted his crimson Armani suit in the rearview mirror of his Bentley Continental. At 42, he had perfected the art of looking successful. Every thread in place, every decision calculated, every emotion carefully locked away behind walls built from years of boardroom battles and personal failures. His manicured fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he waited for the light to change at the intersection of State and Madison. The city hummed around him with its familiar symphony of honking horns, construction noise, and the distant rumble of the L train. Albert's phone buzzed against the dashboard. Another call from his assistant about the Morrison account, no doubt. He let it ring. The light turned green, but traffic barely crawled forward. Albert's jaw tightened as he glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. The quarterly board meeting was in 30 minutes, and being late wasn't an option, especially not when the board was already questioning his judgment after the Henderson merger fell through last month. As his Bentley inched forward, Albert's eyes swept across the sidewalk with practiced indifference. Chicago's streets were full of people with problems, panhandlers, street performers, activists with signs. He'd learned long ago to look through them rather than at them. It was easier that way, less complicated, but something made him look twice at the small figure huddled near the bus stop. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, sat on a weathered wooden bench that had seen better decades. Her dark skin held an ashen quality that spoke of sleepless nights and empty stomachs. She wore a grey cardigan that was too big for her tiny frame, the sleeves rolled up several times to reveal delicate wrists. Her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, though wispy strands had escaped to frame her face. What stopped Albert's world wasn't her appearance, though. It was the sign she held. Written in careful, childish handwriting on a piece of torn cardboard were the words, "Need a ride to Mom's hospital room." What do you think when you see someone so young facing such an enormous challenge? Have you ever witnessed a moment that made you question everything about how we help each other? Share your thoughts below. The girl's eyes, large, dark, and filled with a determination that seemed impossibly mature for her age, met Albert's through the tinted window of his Bentley. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, neither of them moved. She didn't wave or gesture. She simply held his gaze with the kind of quiet desperation that reaches across class lines and touches something primal in the human soul. Albert's throat tightened. Somewhere deep in his chest, a door he'd kept locked for 3 years creaked open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. And pain. Always the pain. Traffic lurched forward again, breaking the spell. Albert pressed the accelerator, his Bentley gliding past the bus stop with its luxury suspension absorbing every bump in the road. In his rearview mirror, he watched the little girl grow smaller, still sitting on that bench, still holding her sign, still waiting for someone to care enough to stop. His phone buzzed again. This time, Albert answered. "Richardson. Mr. Richardson, the Morrison files are ready for your review, and the board members are starting to arrive." His assistant's voice crackled through the Bluetooth speakers. "Should I push back the meeting if you're running late?" Albert turned the corner, putting the bus stop out of sight. "No, Margaret. I'll be there in 5 minutes." But as he navigated through Chicago's downtown traffic, Albert couldn't shake the image of those dark eyes or the careful lettering on that cardboard sign. His mind, trained to compartmentalize and prioritize, kept drifting back to the bus stop despite his best efforts to focus on the day ahead. He pulled into the underground garage of Richardson Holdings headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower of glass and steel that bore his family name in elegant serif letters. Albert had inherited this empire from his father, grown it, shaped it into something that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The employees who greeted him in the elevator spoke in respectful tones, their voices tinged with the careful deference reserved for men who sign paychecks and determine careers. But as Albert straightened his tie in the elevator's mirrored walls, all he could see was a little girl with a cardboard sign, sitting alone at a bus stop while the world rushed past her. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline. 12 men and 3 women in expensive suits sat around a polished mahogany table, their faces arranged in expressions of professional attentiveness. Albert took his place at the head of the table, his movements automatic and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today," Albert began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had served him well for years. "As you know, we're here to discuss the third quarter projections and the potential acquisition of." His words trailed off as his gaze drifted to the window. Somewhere out there, beyond the glass and steel and carefully manicured success, a little girl was still waiting, still holding her sign, still hoping that someone would care enough to help her reach her mother. Albert. The voice belonged to Janet Morrison, the silver-haired board member who'd been questioning his decisions with increasing frequency. The acquisition. Albert blinked, refocusing on the room full of expectant faces. Right. The acquisition. He shuffled through his notes, but the words seemed to blur together. "I think we should table this discussion." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Albert Richardson didn't table discussions. He made decisions, took action, moved forward with the kind of relentless determination that had built Richardson Holdings into a billion-dollar empire. "Table it?" Janet's eyebrows rose. "Albert, we've been planning this meeting for weeks. The Morrison deal alone could." "I said we're tabling it." Albert stood abruptly, his chair rolling back with enough force to bump against the window behind him. "Something's come up. Something urgent." He was out of the boardroom before anyone could respond, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floors as he strode toward the elevator. Behind him, he could hear the confused murmur of voices, the rustle of papers, the subtle sounds of a carefully orchestrated meeting falling apart. Albert didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, something mattered more than quarterly reports and acquisition deals. Something mattered more than the empire his father had built and the reputation he'd spent his adult life protecting. The elevator descended in silence, each floor marked by a soft chime that seemed to count down to a moment Albert couldn't yet define. When the doors opened to the parking garage, he moved with purpose toward his Bentley, his fingers already reaching for the keys. 20 minutes later, Albert pulled up to the same intersection where he'd first seen the girl. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the bus stop, half expecting to find it empty, to discover that the moment had passed and the opportunity had vanished like so many others in his carefully controlled life. But she was still there. Viola, though Albert didn't know her name yet, sat on the same weathered bench, her small hands still gripping the cardboard sign. Her head was tilted back against the metal frame of the bus stop, her eyes closed as if she was gathering strength for whatever came next. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass shelter, casting patterns of light and shadow across her delicate features. Albert pulled over to the curb, his Bentley's engine purring to a stop. Through the tinted windows, he studied the girl who had derailed his entire day. She looked so small, so impossibly vulnerable, sitting there with her handwritten plea for help. What would you do in Albert's position? When was the last time you let your heart override your head? Tell us about a time you took a leap of faith. As if sensing his presence, Viola opened her eyes and turned toward the black luxury car. Her gaze found Albert through the windshield, and once again, that connection sparked between them. Two strangers separated by wealth and circumstance, but somehow bound together by the threads of fate and human need. Albert's hand trembled slightly as he rolled down the window. The sounds of the city rushed in, traffic, construction, the distant call of vendors, But all of it faded into background noise as he looked directly at the little girl who had upended his world. "Hey there," he said, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years. "I saw your sign." Viola's eyes widened at the sound of Albert's voice. She had been sitting at this bus stop for 3 hours, watching car after car pass by without slowing. Most people didn't even look in her direction. Those who did see her quickly averted their gaze, as if her need was something contagious they might catch if they stared too long. But this man in the shiny black car had not only looked, he had stopped. He had spoken to her. "You saw my sign?" Viola's voice was small but clear, carrying the careful pronunciation of a child who had been taught to speak properly despite the chaos surrounding her young life. Albert nodded, finding it difficult to form words around the sudden tightness in his throat. Up close, the girl looked even younger than he'd initially thought. Her face held that soft roundness of early childhood, but her eyes carried shadows that belonged to someone much older. There was a smudge of dirt on her left cheek, and her cardigan had a small tear near the hem. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Albert asked, the endearment slipping out before he could stop it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken to a child, couldn't remember when his voice had held such gentleness. "Viola," she answered, shifting slightly on the bench, but not letting go of her sign. "Like the flower, Mama says. She picked it because violets are strong. They can grow anywhere, even in sidewalk cracks." The simple poetry of her mother's explanation hit Albert harder than he expected. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening beneath his expensive suit. "That's a beautiful name, Viola. Can you tell me about your mama?" Viola's face brightened for the first time since Albert had been watching her. The transformation was stunning, like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Mama's the prettiest lady in the whole world," she said, her words tumbling over each other with sudden enthusiasm. "She has hair like mine but longer, and she makes these little braids with ribbons when she's feeling good. She sings in the mornings when she makes our cereal, not the fancy kind with the pictures on the box, just the store kind, but she makes it taste special by humming while she pours the milk." Albert's chest constricted. The image Viola painted was so vivid, so filled with love despite obvious hardship, that it made his own privileged childhood seem sterile by comparison. "She sounds wonderful. Is she sick?" The brightness faded from Viola's face like someone had dimmed a light switch. She looked down at her small hands, still clutching the cardboard sign. "Mama fell down 3 days ago. She was cooking eggs for breakfast, and she just fell down. Mrs. Jenkins from next door called the ambulance, and they took Mama to the big hospital with all the bright lights." "Where have you been staying since then?" Albert's question was barely above a whisper. He already suspected the answer, but he needed to hear it confirmed. "Mrs. Jenkins said I could sleep on her couch for 1 night, but then she said her grandson was coming to visit, and there wasn't room for me no more." Viola's voice grew smaller. "I've been staying in the park mostly. There's a good spot under the big oak tree where the branches make like a roof." The words hit Albert like a physical blow. This 5-year-old child had been homeless for 2 days, sleeping in a park, trying to find a way to reach her hospitalized mother. While Albert had been in boardroom meetings discussing million-dollar acquisitions, Viola had been surviving on the streets. "Viola, honey, why don't you come sit in the car with me?" Albert's voice was gentler than he'd known it could be. "We can figure out how to get you to your mama together." For the first time, Viola hesitated. She studied Albert's face through the passenger window, her young mind weighing trust against necessity. "Mama always told me not to go with strangers," she said carefully. "Even nice strangers." "Your mama is very smart," Albert replied, his heart breaking at this child's careful wisdom. "That's exactly what you should do, be careful. But right now, you need help getting to her, don't you?" Viola nodded slowly. "The hospital is real far. I tried walking yesterday, but my legs got too tired, and I got lost. The bus costs money, and I don't have any money." Albert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. The gesture was automatic, the solution that had served him well throughout his adult life. Throw money at the problem until it disappeared. But as he looked at the worn leather billfold in his hands, filled with credit cards and $100 bills, He realized that this moment required something more valuable than money. It required him to care, to act, to become involved in another person's story in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do in 3 years. "What if I promise you that I'm safe?" Albert said, setting his wallet on the passenger seat without opening it. "What if I promise that I'll take you straight to your mama and make sure you're okay?" Viola studied his face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she stood up from the bench, carefully folding her cardboard sign and tucking it under her arm like a precious document. "Okay," she said simply. "But if you try to hurt me, I'll scream real loud. Mrs. Jenkins taught me that." "Mrs. Jenkins sounds like a good neighbor," Albert said, reaching across to open the passenger door from the inside. "I promise you won't need to scream, Viola. I just want to help you get to your mama." Viola approached the Bentley with the cautious grace of a small animal approaching a food source, hopeful but ready to run at the first sign of danger. She climbed into the passenger seat with some difficulty, her legs too short to reach the floor comfortably. The soft leather seat seemed to swallow her small frame, and Albert noticed how the luxury of his car, the polished wood trim, the subtle ambient lighting, the whisper-quiet climate control, created an almost otherworldly contrast to the reality of this child's life. "This is the fanciest car I ever been in," Viola said in wonder, running her small hand along the leather armrest. "It's like a car for a prince or something." Albert managed a small smile as he adjusted the seat belt to fit her properly. The simple task of ensuring her safety felt monumentally important, as if he was crossing some invisible threshold from observer to protector. "What hospital is your mama at, Viola?" "The big one with the cross on top," she said, buckling the chest strap with practiced efficiency. "Chicago General, I think." The ambulance man said they was taking her to Chicago General. Albert's blood ran cold. Chicago General Hospital was where emergency cases went when they couldn't afford better care. It was a public hospital, understaffed and overwhelmed, where patients often waited hours for attention and families slept in uncomfortable chairs because they couldn't afford hotel rooms. It was also where his daughter Emma had been taken 3 years ago, after the accident. Have you ever had a moment where helping someone else ended up helping heal something in yourself? Sometimes the people we're meant to help are actually the ones meant to help us. What do you think about that? Albert's hands trembled slightly as he put the Bentley in drive. The familiar streets of Chicago blurred past the windows, but his mind was traveling backward in time, to another October day when everything had changed. Emma had been 7 years old, with bright blonde hair and his own blue eyes, full of questions about everything and stories that never seemed to end. She had been riding her bike in their gated communities, supposedly safe streets, when a distracted driver ran the stop sign. Chicago General. The same emergency room. The same smell of disinfectant and desperation. The same feeling of helplessness as doctors in scrubs delivered news that shattered everything he thought he knew about how the world was supposed to work. "Mister?" Viola's small voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you okay? You look sad." Albert glanced at her in the rearview mirror and was struck by the concern in her young face. Here was a child who had every reason to be focused on her own problems, yet she had noticed his distress and cared enough to ask about it. The compassion in her voice was like a hand reaching out in the dark. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he said, though the words felt like lies. "I was just thinking about someone I used to know." "Someone who made you sad?" Viola asked with the directness that only children possess. Albert was quiet for a long moment, navigating through traffic while wrestling with emotions he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. "Yeah," he finally admitted. "Someone who made me very sad when she had to go away. Like my mama had to go to the hospital? Something like that." Viola was quiet for several blocks, processing this information with the seriousness of someone far older than her 5 years. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but determined. "When Mama gets better, maybe she can make you feel less sad too. Mama's real good at making people feel better. That's what Mrs. Jenkins says." The simple offer of comfort from this child, who had so little to give, nearly undid Albert completely. He pulled over to the curb, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 3 years. His shoulders shook with the force of emotions he'd kept locked away, and for a moment, the successful businessman facade crumbled entirely. "Mister?" Viola's voice was smaller now, worried. "Did I say something wrong?" Albert wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. When he turned to look at Viola, her face was filled with such genuine concern that it took his breath away. This child, who had been abandoned and left to sleep in parks, who was desperately trying to reach her sick mother, was worried about his feelings. "No, honey," Albert said, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't say anything wrong. You said something very, very right." He reached across the car and gently touched Viola's hand. Her skin was soft and warm, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers. In that touch, something shifted between them. A connection that went beyond the simple interaction of stranger helping stranger. "You know what, Viola?" Albert said, making a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "I think your mama is going to be very proud of how brave and smart you've been. And I think I'd really like to meet her." Viola's face lit up with the first genuine smile Albert had seen from her. It was like watching a flower bloom in fast forward, transforming her entire appearance from that of a lost child to a little girl filled with hope and excitement. "Really? You want to meet Mama?" "Really," Albert confirmed, pulling back into traffic with new purpose. "But first, we need to get you to her. And I think maybe we should stop and get you something to eat on the way. When's the last time you had a real meal?" Viola's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, providing its own answer. She looked down at her belly with embarrassment, her cheeks flushing darker. "I had some crackers yesterday," she said quietly. "Mrs. Rodriguez at the corner store gave them to me when she was throwing away the old ones." Albert's jaw tightened with anger, not at Viola, but at a world that could allow a 5-year-old child to survive on discarded crackers, while men like him argued over profit margins in air-conditioned boardrooms. The contrast was so stark, so fundamentally wrong, that it made him question everything he'd believed about success and worth, and what truly mattered in life. "Well, that's not nearly enough," Albert said firmly. "We're going to fix that right now." He pulled into the parking lot of a small family restaurant, the kind of place he would normally never notice. Clean but unpretentious, with hand-painted signs advertising daily specials, and a warmth that spoke of generations of family ownership. As he helped Viola out of the car, Albert noticed how she moved carefully, conserving energy like someone who had learned not to waste anything, including motion. Inside the restaurant, the hostess, a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes, looked at the unlikely pair with curiosity. Albert in his expensive crimson suit and Viola in her oversized cardigan made quite a contrast. But the woman's expression softened when she saw how Albert's hand rested protectively on Viola's shoulder. "Table for two?" she asked warmly. "Yes, please," Albert replied. "Somewhere quiet, if you have it." They were seated in a corner booth, and Albert watched as Viola's eyes grew wide at the sight of the menu. She handled it carefully, as if it were made of something precious and fragile, her lips moving silently as she read the options. "Can I really order anything?" she asked in a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the opportunity disappear. "Anything you want," Albert confirmed. "What sounds good to you?" Viola studied the menu with the intensity of someone making a life-altering decision. When the waitress came to take their order, she looked up with shining eyes. "Could I please have the pancakes with strawberries?" she asked politely. "And maybe some orange juice?" It was such a simple request, the kind of breakfast order thousands of children made every day without thinking twice about it. But coming from Viola, who had been eating discarded crackers and sleeping in parks, it carried the weight of dreams fulfilled and dignity restored. "Of course, sweetie," the waitress said with a smile that suggested she understood there was more to this story than met the eye. "And for you, sir?" Albert realized he hadn't even looked at the menu. Food was the furthest thing from his mind. "Just coffee, please." "Black." As they waited for the food to arrive, Albert found himself really looking at Viola for the first time. Beneath the dirt and the too large clothes and the careful wariness, he could see the child she was meant to be. Bright, curious, full of love despite everything she'd endured. Her resilience was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Viola," he said carefully, "can you tell me more about your mama? What's her name?" "Grace," Viola said immediately, her face lighting up at the opportunity to talk about her mother. "Grace Washington. She works at the cleaning company. You know, the one with the green trucks. She cleans offices at night, so she can be home with me during the day, except sometimes she's real tired and needs to sleep." Albert felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Grace Washington was a night shift janitor, probably making minimum wage, and struggling to support herself and her daughter. No health insurance, no safety net, no family to call when emergencies struck. The kind of person whose absence from work for even a few days could mean eviction and hunger. "She sounds like a wonderful mama," Albert said sincerely. "She is," Viola agreed emphatically. "She reads me stories every night, even when she's tired from work. And she knows all the words to every song on the radio. Sometimes she dances with me in our kitchen. It's real small, but she says that just means we don't have to dance very far to be together." The image was so vivid and beautiful that Albert could almost see it. A young mother and her daughter, creating joy in a tiny apartment, finding reasons to dance despite poverty and struggle, and all the ways the world tried to beat them down. When Viola's pancakes arrived, she stared at them for a long moment before carefully cutting off a small piece. She chewed slowly, methodically, as if she wanted to make the experience last as long as possible. Halfway through the stack, she looked up at Albert with syrup on her chin and something close to bliss in her eyes. "These are the best pancakes in the whole world," she declared solemnly. Albert found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I'm glad you like them, sweetheart." As Viola ate, Albert's phone buzzed repeatedly with messages and calls. The board meeting he'd abandoned, the Morrison deal, the dozens of daily crises that usually consumed his attention. But for the first time in his adult life, none of it seemed important compared to watching a little girl enjoy a simple breakfast and knowing he was about to help her reunite with the person she loved most in the world. When Viola had eaten as much as she could manage, which was about half the enormous stack of pancakes, Albert paid the bill and helped her back to the car. She moved more slowly now, her belly full and her energy flagging as the adrenaline of their meeting began to wear off. "How much longer to the hospital?" she asked as Albert started the engine. "About 15 minutes, he replied, pulling back onto the street that led toward Chicago General Hospital. "Are you nervous about seeing your mama?" Viola considered this question seriously. "A little," she admitted. "What if she's really sick? What if the doctors can't make her better?" The fear in her voice was so raw, so heartbreaking, that Albert had to pause before responding. This was a conversation no 5-year-old should have to have, a worry no child should carry. But Viola was carrying it anyway, with the same quiet strength she'd shown in everything else. "You know what I think?" Albert said carefully. "I think your mama is going to get better, because she has the most important medicine there is. She has you to come back to. That's pretty powerful stuff." Viola smiled at this, and Albert hoped desperately that he wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. As they drove through the city streets toward the hospital, Albert found himself hoping for something he hadn't dared hope for in 3 years. That this story would have a happy ending. That love would be enough. That sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys won and families were reunited, and little girls got to dance with their mamas in tiny kitchens. The towers of Chicago General Hospital came into view ahead of them, and Albert felt Viola tense beside him in the passenger seat. Whatever they found there would change both of their lives. He was certain of that. The only question was how. Chicago General Hospital loomed before them like a fortress of glass and concrete, its emergency room entrance marked by red signs and the constant flow of ambulances, their sirens wailing through the October afternoon. Albert's Bentley looked absurdly out of place in the visitor parking lot, surrounded by dented sedans, rusted pickup trucks, and cars held together by prayer and duct tape. As Albert turned off the engine, the silence in the car became heavy with unspoken fears. Viola pressed her small face against the passenger window, staring up at the towering building where her mother lay somewhere beyond those walls. "It's so big," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How are we going to find Mama in there?" Albert followed her gaze to the hospital's imposing facade. The building seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. All sharp angles and reflective surfaces that threw back distorted images of the people approaching its doors. He remembered this feeling from 3 years ago, the way the hospital had seemed to swallow him whole, transforming him from a powerful businessman into just another desperate family member waiting for news. "We'll find her," Albert said, though his own voice carried uncertainty. "The people inside will help us." But even as he spoke the words, Albert knew it wouldn't be that simple. Chicago General was overwhelmed on good days, understaffed and underfunded, with wait times that stretched into hours and a bureaucracy that seemed designed to exhaust people into giving up. For someone like Grace Washington, an uninsured night shift janitor, the level of care and attention would be minimal at best. Viola unbuckled her seatbelt with careful precision, her small fingers working the mechanism with the focused concentration of someone who had learned to be self-sufficient far too young. Albert came around to help her out of the car, and as they walked across the parking lot together, he noticed how she stayed close to his side without actually touching him. Near enough for protection, but maintaining the careful distance of someone who had learned not to trust too easily. The automatic doors of the hospital emergency room whooshed open with a mechanical sigh, releasing a wave of institutional air, disinfectant, floor wax, and something harder to define that Albert recognized as the smell of fear and waiting. The lobby was exactly as he remembered. Rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs filled with people in various stages of distress, fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh relief, and the constant background noise of overhead pages, crying babies, and hushed conversations. Albert approached the information desk, where a tired-looking woman in scrubs sat behind bulletproof glass, barely looking up from her computer screen as they approached. "Excuse me," Albert said, his boardroom voice automatically taking on the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate attention. "We're looking for Grace Washington. She was brought in 3 days ago." The woman's eyes flicked up to take in Albert's expensive suit, then shifted to Viola, who was standing on tiptoe to see over the high counter. Something in her expression softened slightly at the sight of the little girl. "Are you family?" she asked, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "This is her daughter," Albert replied, placing a protective hand on Viola's shoulder. He felt the child tense beneath his touch, as if bracing herself for bad news. The woman's expression grew more sympathetic. "Honey, what's your name?" she asked Viola directly. "Viola Washington," came the small voice. "Is my mama okay?" The receptionist typed rapidly, her eyes scanning whatever information appeared on her screen. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Albert and Viola waited, the ambient noise of the emergency room fading into white noise around them. "She's here," the woman finally said, and Albert felt Viola's entire body relax with relief. "She's on the 4th floor, medical unit." "But sweetie," the woman's voice became gentler. "Visiting hours ended an hour ago. You'll have to come back tomorrow morning at 8. The words hit Viola like a physical blow. Albert watched as her face crumpled, all the hope and determination that had carried her through the past 3 days suddenly draining away. Her small shoulders began to shake, and when she looked up at Albert, her eyes were filled with tears that she was fighting desperately to hold back. "But I came so far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I waited and waited, and I found someone to bring me, and now I can't see her." Albert felt something fierce and protective surge through him. He leaned down until he was at eye level with the receptionist, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone he reserved for hostile takeovers and boardroom battles. "Ma'am, this little girl has been homeless for 3 days trying to get to her mother. She's been sleeping in parks and living on scraps of food. I don't care about your visiting hours. She needs to see her mama. Right now." The receptionist looked startled by the intensity in Albert's voice, but she shook her head regretfully. "Sir, I understand, but hospital policy is—" "I don't want to hear about hospital policy," Albert interrupted, straightening to his full height. I want to speak to your supervisor. Now, Albert. The small voice at his side made him pause. Viola was looking up at him with something that might have been concern, despite her own devastation. Don't be angry at the nice lady. She's just doing her job, like Mama always says people gotta do. The simple wisdom in Viola's words, her ability to show grace even in the face of disappointment, humbled Albert completely. Here was a child teaching him about compassion and understanding, even when the system was failing her in the most fundamental way. The receptionist had been watching this exchange with growing interest, and when Viola spoke, her professional mask slipped entirely. Honey, how old are you? She asked gently. 5, Viola replied, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her cardigan. I'll be 6 next month, but Mama might not, she might not. The words trailed off as Viola realized what she was saying. The woman behind the desk made a decision. You know what? Let me call up to the 4th floor and see what I can do. Sometimes we can make exceptions for special circumstances. As she picked up the phone, Albert knelt down beside Viola, whose tears were now flowing freely despite her efforts to be brave. Without thinking, he pulled out his handkerchief, expensive Italian silk, monogrammed with his initials, and gently wiped her cheeks. Hey, he said softly. We're going to see your mama. I promise. What if she doesn't remember me? Viola asked, voicing a fear that Albert recognized as both heartbreaking and surprisingly mature. What if being sick made her forget? Albert thought about his own daughter, about how illness and injury could change people in ways that went far beyond the physical. But looking at this brave little girl, he also thought about the power of love to transcend even the darkest circumstances. Sweethearts like you are impossible to forget, he said, and meant every word. The receptionist hung up the phone with a small smile. Good news. The charge nurse on 4 is willing to bend the rules a little bit. But only for a few minutes, and only because... She looked at Viola meaningfully. Because sometimes the best medicine is family. What do you think about the power of compassion to change rules and open doors? Have you ever seen someone break protocol because it was the right thing to do? Share a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt endless. Viola stood pressed against Albert's side, her small hand finding his larger one and gripping it tightly. Albert was surprised by how natural it felt, how right it seemed to be offering comfort to this child who had somehow become so important to him in the span of a few hours. Mr. Albert? Viola's voice was very small in the confined space of the elevator. Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for helping me. Even if Mama is real sick, thank you for bringing me to her. Albert squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for letting me help you. The 4th floor of Chicago General was a maze of corridors that all looked the same, beige walls, industrial carpeting, and the constant hum of machines keeping people alive. The charge nurse who met them at the elevator was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the competent bearing of someone who had seen everything the world could throw at a hospital. You must be Viola, she said, crouching down to the little girl's level. I'm Nurse Patricia. Your mama has been asking about you every day since she got here. Viola's face lit up with hope. She has? She's awake. She's awake, Patricia confirmed, then looked meaningfully at Albert. But I need to prepare you both for what you're going to see. Your mama has been very sick, sweetheart. She's going to look different than you remember, and she might be very tired. Albert felt Viola's hand tighten in his as Patricia led them down the hallway. Room numbers flashed past. 412, 414, 416. Each one bringing them closer to whatever they would find behind the door marked 418. Before we go in, Patricia said, stopping just outside the room, I want you to know that your mama is going to be okay. It's going to take time, and she's going to need to stay here for a while longer, but she's going to get better. The relief that washed over Viola was visible, her entire body sagging, as if she'd been carrying a weight too heavy for her small frame. Really? She's really going to be okay. Really, Patricia assured her. Now, are you ready to see her? Viola looked up at Albert, and he saw his own nervousness reflected in her dark eyes. Neither of them knew what they would find on the other side of that door, But they had come this far together, and Albert found himself unwilling to let her face whatever came next alone. "We're ready," he said, speaking for both of them. Patricia pushed open the door to room 418, and Albert's breath caught in his throat. The woman lying in the hospital bed was clearly Viola's mother. The resemblance was unmistakable in the shape of her face and the elegant curve of her neck. But Grace Washington looked impossibly fragile, her dark skin ashen against the white hospital sheets, for tubes snaking from her arms, and machines monitoring her vital signs with steady electronic beeps. For a moment, nobody moved. Grace's eyes were closed, and the rise and fall of her chest was so slight that Albert found himself watching for it, needing confirmation that she was truly alive and breathing. Then Grace's eyelids fluttered open, and her gaze found her daughter standing in the doorway. "Viola?" The word was barely a whisper, but it carried such love, such desperate relief, that Albert felt his throat close with emotion. "My baby girl, where have you been?" Viola flew across the room to her mother's bedside, Albert and Patricia forgotten in the intensity of the reunion. She climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of the tubes and wires, and buried her face against Grace's neck. "Mama, I was so scared," Viola cried, her words muffled against her mother's hospital gown. "I didn't know where you were, and Mrs. Jenkins couldn't keep me, and I slept in the park, but I wasn't scared because I knew you were going to get better, and I just had to find you." Grace's arms came up to encircle her daughter, and Albert watched as both of them began to cry. Not the desperate tears of fear and separation, but the healing tears of reunion and relief. Grace's eyes met Albert's over Viola's head, and the question in them was clear. Who was this man, and how had he brought her daughter to her? "Mama," Viola said, lifting her head to look at her mother's face. "This is Mr. Albert. He found me at the bus stop and bought me pancakes and brought me to see you. He's real nice, and he has a fancy car like a prince." Grace tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, wincing with the effort. Albert could see her trying to process this information, her maternal instincts warring with gratitude and confusion. A strange man had brought her daughter to the hospital. This should terrify her, but Viola was safe and well-fed and clearly comfortable with Albert's presence. "Thank you," Grace said to Albert, her voice hoarse but sincere. "I don't know how to thank you for bringing her to me. I've been going crazy worrying about where she was, if she was safe." "She's been very brave," Albert replied, finding himself surprisingly emotional. "And very smart. She never gave up on finding you." Patricia cleared her throat gently. "I hate to interrupt, but I can only give you a few more minutes before I have to ask you to leave. Hospital rules." The reminder of how tenuous this reunion was hit all of them simultaneously. Grace's grip on Viola tightened, as if she could somehow prevent another separation through sheer will. "Where is she going to stay tonight?" Grace asked, and Albert heard the desperation beneath her calm tone. "She can't go back to sleeping in the park. She's just a baby." "I'll figure something out," Albert said quickly, though he hadn't actually thought that far ahead. "She'll be safe, I promise." "But who are you?" Grace asked, studying Albert's face with the intensity of a mother protecting her child. "Why are you helping us?" It was a fair question, and one that Albert wasn't sure he could answer honestly. How could he explain that helping Viola had awakened something in him that had been dead for 3 years? How could he tell this woman that her daughter had somehow reached through his grief and made him feel human again? "Sometimes people just need help," he said finally. "And sometimes helping someone else is exactly what you need to do." Grace studied his face for a long moment, and Albert had the unsettling feeling that she could see straight through him to the pain he carried. There was wisdom in her eyes that went beyond her years, the kind of understanding that came from facing life's hardest challenges and somehow finding the strength to keep going. "Viola tells me you look sad," Grace said quietly. "Like you lost someone important." Albert's composure nearly cracked. This woman, lying in a hospital bed, worried about her child's safety and facing an uncertain future, was concerned about his emotional well-being. The kindness of it, the generous spirit that clearly ran in this family, was almost more than he could bear. "I did lose someone important," Albert admitted, his voice barely steady. A long time ago. Grace reached out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Albert took it. Her grip was weak but warm, and in her touch he felt something he'd been missing for 3 years. Human connection, forgiveness, the possibility that healing wasn't just for other people. "I'm sorry," Grace said simply. "Losing people we love. It changes everything, doesn't it?" Before Albert could respond, Patricia returned with her apologetic expression. "I really do need to ask you to wrap up now. But Grace, the good news is that if everything continues to go well, we might be able to discharge you in a few days." "A few days?" Viola's voice was small. "But where am I going to stay until then?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Albert looked at this child who had somehow become so important to him, at her mother, who was trying to be strong despite her obvious fear and weakness, and made a decision that surprised even him. "You'll stay with me," he said. The silence that followed his words was profound. Grace's grip on his hand tightened, and Viola looked between the adults with hope and confusion warring in her expression. "Sir," Patricia said carefully, "that's very kind, but there are procedures for situations like this. Child services will need to be involved, background checks." "Then we'll do whatever needs to be done," Albert said firmly. "But this little girl isn't sleeping in any more parks, and she isn't going into the system if I can help it." Grace was studying Albert's face with new intensity. "You don't even know us," she said quietly. "Why would you do this?" Albert looked down at Viola, who was watching him with those wise, dark eyes that seemed to see straight to his soul. The answer came to him with surprising clarity. "Because she reminded me that there are still good things in this world worth protecting," he said. "And because I think maybe she needs me almost as much as I need her." The truth of those words settled over the room like a benediction, and Albert realized that somewhere between the bus stop and this hospital room, everything had changed. He was no longer just a successful businessman going through the motions of living. He was someone who had been trusted with something precious, someone who had been given a chance to matter in a way he'd forgotten was possible. Viola climbed down from her mother's bed and walked over to Albert, looking up at him with serious consideration. "If I stay with you," she said carefully, "can I call you Uncle Albert? Mrs. Jenkins says that's what you call nice men who aren't your daddy, but who take care of you anyway." Albert knelt down to her level, his vision blurring with tears he didn't try to hide. "I would be honored if you called me Uncle Albert." Viola smiled then, the first completely carefree smile Albert had seen from her, and threw her small arms around his neck. As he held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the trust in her embrace, Albert realized that this broken little girl was somehow making him whole again. But even as hope began to bloom in his chest, Albert knew that the hardest parts were still ahead. There would be paperwork and questions, social workers and bureaucracy. Grace would need time to recover, and Viola would need stability and care, and all the things that Albert wasn't sure he knew how to provide. The next few days would test all of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The next morning arrived with the grey promise of rain, October's chill seeping through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Albert's penthouse apartment. Viola stood at the vast expanse of glass, her small hand pressed against the cool surface as she stared down at the city 40 floors below. She wore one of Albert's dress shirts as a nightgown, the white cotton fabric pooling around her feet like a wedding dress designed for a doll. Albert watched her from the kitchen doorway, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands and a knot of anxiety in his stomach that had been growing since dawn. In 12 hours, his life had been completely upended. His pristine, sterile apartment, all chrome and leather and carefully curated art, now showed signs of a child's presence. A small dent in the couch where Viola had curled up to sleep, her cardigan draped over a chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her worn sneakers sitting beside his Italian leather shoes like a question mark punctuating his perfectly ordered life. "The cars look like ants from up here," Viola said without turning around, her breath fogging the glass. "Do you think they know how small they look?" "Probably not," Albert replied, setting his coffee down and joining her at the window. "Sometimes when we're in the middle of our own lives, we can't see the bigger picture." Viola nodded solemnly, as if this observation contained profound wisdom. Mama says that too. She says sometimes you gotta step back to see what's really going on. The mention of Grace sent a fresh wave of uncertainty through Albert. In 3 hours, he had an appointment with Linda Morrison from the Department of Children and Family Services, a meeting that would determine whether Viola could stay with him while her mother recovered, or whether she would be placed in temporary foster care. Albert had spent most of the night researching emergency guardianship laws and making phone calls to the most expensive lawyers in Chicago, but none of their reassurances had eased the fear that this precious, fragile arrangement might crumble at the first official scrutiny. Uncle Albert? Viola's voice was smaller now, uncertain. What happens if the lady today says I can't stay with you? Albert knelt beside her, meeting her eyes at her level. In the harsh morning light, he could see the exhaustion that still lingered beneath her brave facade, the way her small shoulders carried tension that no 5-year-old should know. That's not going to happen, he said with more confidence than he felt. I promised your mama that you'd be safe, and I keep my promises. But even as he spoke the words, Albert knew that promises might not be enough. Linda Morrison would look at this situation and see red flags everywhere. A wealthy single man with no experience caring for children, taking in a homeless girl he'd known for less than 24 hours. On paper, it looked exactly like the kind of scenario social services existed to prevent. The doorbell chimed with crystalline precision, echoing through the apartment like a funeral bell. Albert's housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, appeared from the kitchen to answer it, but Albert waved her off. I'll get it, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Linda Morrison was a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen too many children failed by the adults who were supposed to protect them. She wore a sensible dark suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it contained the power to change lives with the stroke of a pen. Mr. Richardson, she said, shaking Albert's hand with a grip that suggested she was not easily impressed by wealth or authority. Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. Of course, Albert replied, stepping aside to let her into his apartment. Viola is in the living room. Would you like some coffee? That would be fine. Linda's eyes were already scanning the space, taking in the expensive furnishings, the pristine surfaces, the complete absence of anything that suggested a child lived here. This is quite a beautiful home. Thank you, Albert said, though he heard the subtext in her words. Beautiful, but not built for children. They found Viola exactly where Albert had left her, still standing at the window, but now turned toward them with the careful politeness of a child who understood that her future hung in the balance of this conversation. She had changed into her own clothes, the grey cardigan and worn jeans that suddenly seemed even more shabby in the context of Albert's luxury apartment. Hello, Viola, Linda said, her voice gentling as she addressed the child. I'm Ms. Morrison. I work for the city, and my job is to make sure children are safe and taken care of. Can we sit down and talk for a little bit? Viola looked to Albert for reassurance before nodding and settling onto the edge of the massive leather sectional. Albert sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to appear possessive or controlling. Viola, can you tell me how you met Mr. Richardson? Linda asked, pulling out a tablet and stylus. For the next 20 minutes, Linda asked careful, thorough questions about the previous day's events. Viola answered with the directness of childhood, describing her days sleeping in the park, her desperate attempt to reach her mother, and Albert's unexpected appearance in her life. Albert found himself holding his breath as she spoke, marveling again at this child's resilience and clarity. And how do you feel about staying here with Mr. Richardson? Linda asked. Safe, Viola answered immediately. Uncle Albert makes me feel safe. And he promised Mama that he'd take care of me until she gets better. Uncle Albert? Linda's eyebrows rose slightly, and she made a note on her tablet. That's what Mrs. Jenkins says you call nice men who aren't your daddy, but who help you anyway, Viola explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone quoting an absolute authority. Linda nodded, but Albert could see her filing away every detail, weighing every interaction against whatever criteria she used to determine a child's welfare. When she asked to speak with Albert privately, he felt his heart rate spike with anxiety. They moved to Albert's home office, a masculine space of dark wood and leather-bound books that felt like a fortress against the uncertainties of the outside world. Linda closed the door with deliberate precision and turned to face him. "Mr. Richardson," she began, her voice professional but not unkind, "I have to tell you, this situation raises some significant concerns." Albert had been expecting this, but hearing it stated so directly still felt like a physical blow. "What kind of concerns?" "Well, for starters, you have no background in childcare, no family support system that I can see, and no existing relationship with this child beyond yesterday's encounter." Linda consulted her tablet. "Your apartment, while beautiful, isn't child-proofed. You work long hours in what I understand is a high-stress job. And frankly, the circumstances of how you met Viola, a wealthy man picking up a homeless child, raises questions about motivation that I have to address." Each point hit Albert like an accusation, and he felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "My motivation is helping a child who needed help," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "I don't see how that's suspicious. In my experience, Mr. Richardson, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is." Linda's voice remained calm, but Albert could hear the steel beneath it. Wealthy strangers don't usually upend their lives for homeless children they've never met. It happens in movies, but not in real life. Maybe that's because real life doesn't give us enough opportunities to be better than we are, Albert shot back, surprising himself with the passion in his voice. Maybe that's because we've all gotten so cynical that we can't recognize genuine compassion when we see it. Linda studied his face for a long moment, and Albert had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see straight through his defenses to the grief and guilt he carried. "Tell me about your daughter," she said quietly. The words hit Albert like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending his carefully maintained composure crashing to the ground. He sank into his desk chair, his face going pale. "How did you?" "I did my research, Mr. Richardson. Emma Richardson, age 7, died 3 years ago in a car accident. Hit by a drunk driver while riding her bicycle." Linda's voice was gentler now, but relentless. "You've been living like a hermit ever since, throwing yourself into work, avoiding any situation that might involve children. Until yesterday." Albert's hands were shaking as he reached for the glass of water on his desk. The room suddenly felt too small, too airless, as if the walls were closing in around him. "That has nothing to do with this," he said, but the words came out weak and unconvincing. "Doesn't it?" Linda leaned forward in her chair. "A man who lost his daughter 3 years ago suddenly encounters a little girl in desperate need of help, and he decides to completely change his life for her. You don't see the connection there? You think I'm trying to replace Emma with Viola. It wasn't a question. I think you're a man in pain who might not be thinking clearly about what's best for anyone involved," Linda said carefully. "Including yourself." Albert closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in another hospital room 3 years ago, watching machines keep his daughter alive while doctors explained about brain injuries and the impossibility of recovery. He remembered the moment he'd made the decision to let Emma go, the weight of that choice, the way his world had simply stopped making sense. "She's not Emma," Albert said quietly, opening his eyes to meet Linda's gaze. "Viola is nothing like Emma. She's braver than Emma ever had to be, stronger, more resilient. She's been through things that would break most adults, and she's still capable of kindness and trust and hope. Then why are you doing this?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer that Albert wasn't sure he could articulate. Why was he doing this? What had driven him to abandon a board meeting, upend his carefully ordered life, and make promises to a child he'd known for less than a day? "Because she needed help," Albert said finally. "Because she was alone and scared and trying to be brave, and someone needed to care about what happened to her. Because," his voice broke slightly, "because maybe helping her is the first meaningful thing I've done since Emma died." Linda was quiet for a long moment, studying Albert's face with the intensity of someone trying to read the truth beneath the surface. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Mr. Richardson, I believe that you genuinely want to help Viola. I can see that you care about her welfare. But caring isn't enough. Raising a child, even temporarily, requires skills and stability and emotional resources that I'm not sure you possess right now." "Then what would you have me do?" Albert's voice rose with frustration and desperation. "Send her to foster care? Let her bounce between strangers while her mother recovers? She's been through enough trauma. You want to add more?" "I want what's best for Viola," Linda replied firmly. "Not what makes you feel better about your own loss." The accusation hit Albert like a slap, and he rose from his chair with enough force to send it rolling backward. "You think this is about me feeling better?" He could hear his voice getting louder, could feel 3 years of suppressed grief and anger pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. "You think I picked up a homeless 5-year-old to make myself feel better about losing my daughter? I think you're in pain, and people in pain don't always make the best decisions," Linda said, standing as well. Her voice remained calm, but Albert could see that she was prepared for this conversation to go badly. "What I think," Albert said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "is that you've made up your mind about me before you even walked through that door. Rich man, dead daughter, obvious psychological motives. Case closed. Mr. Richardson." "No." Albert held up his hand to stop her. "You want to know what the best decision for Viola is? It's keeping her with someone who will fight for her, someone who will make sure she gets what she needs, someone who understands that she's been through hell and deserves better than the system's one-size-fits-all solutions. And you think you're that someone? I know I am." The certainty in Albert's voice surprised even him, but as he spoke the words, he realized they were absolutely true. Somewhere between the bus stop and this moment, Viola had become more than a child he was helping. She had become his responsibility, his priority, his chance to be the kind of person he'd forgotten he could be. "Mr. Richardson," Linda said, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. "I've seen this before. Well-meaning adults who think they can save a child, who project their own needs onto a vulnerable situation. It doesn't usually end well. And I've seen the alternative," Albert replied, thinking of the cold institutions and overwhelmed foster families that comprise the city's child welfare system. "Viola deserves better than that." A soft knock on the office door interrupted their confrontation. Mrs. Chen's voice came through the wood. "Mr. Richardson? Ms. Morrison? Viola is asking if everything is okay." The reminder of the child waiting outside hit both adults like a bucket of cold water. They had been arguing about her future while she sat alone, probably listening to their raised voices and wondering if she was about to lose another source of stability in her young life. Albert opened the door to find Viola standing in the hallway, her dark eyes wide with concern and something that looked like fear. She had heard them arguing, had understood that her fate was being decided behind closed doors, and the weight of that knowledge was visible in every line of her small body. "Uncle Albert?" Her voice was very small. "Are you sending me away?" The question broke Albert's heart. This child, who had already been abandoned and left to fend for herself, was facing the possibility of another rejection, another loss, another lesson that the adults in her world couldn't be trusted to keep their promises. Albert knelt down and opened his arms, and Viola flew into them without hesitation. As he held her close, feeling her small body trembling against his chest, Albert made a decision that went beyond legal guardianship or social services approval. "No, sweetheart," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the apartment to where Linda Morrison stood watching. "Nobody is sending you anywhere. I promised your mama I would take care of you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Have you ever had to fight for something you believed in, even when everyone else thought you were wrong? Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. What's worth fighting for in your life?" Linda Morrison watched this exchange with the sharp eyes of someone trained to distinguish between genuine emotion and manipulation. What she saw was a man who had been broken by loss, discovering that he still had the capacity to love and protect. What she saw was a child who had learned not to trust finding someone worthy of that trust. What she saw, despite all her professional training and institutional caution, was a family in the process of forming itself. "Mr. Richardson," Linda said quietly, "can I speak with you for another moment?" Albert looked down at Viola, who was still clinging to him like a lifeline. "Can you wait for me in the living room, sweetheart? Ms. Morrison and I need to finish our conversation." Viola nodded, but didn't move to let go of him. "You promise you won't change your mind?" "I promise," Albert said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. When they were alone again in the office, Linda closed the door and turned to face Albert with an expression he couldn't read. "That little girl loves you," she said simply. "In less than 24 hours, she's formed an attachment to you that most children take weeks or months to develop." Albert nodded, unsure whether this was a good thing or a bad thing in Linda's professional opinion. "The question is," Linda continued, "are you prepared for what that means? Are you ready to be the kind of constant, reliable presence in her life that she needs? Because children who have been through trauma don't bounce back easily from additional losses." "I understand the responsibility," Albert said. "I know this isn't temporary help anymore. I know that once I commit to this, I'm committing to being there for her as long as she needs me. Even when it's difficult. Even when your grief makes it hard to be present for her. Even when the reality of parenting doesn't match whatever fantasy you might have about saving her." Albert thought about Emma, about the joy and frustration and overwhelming love that had defined his experience as a father. He thought about Viola's brave smile and careful politeness, about the way she'd slept curled up on his couch like a small animal finally finding safety. "Especially then," he said. Linda studied his face for what felt like an eternity before nodding slowly. "I'm going to recommend temporary emergency guardianship," she said. "With conditions." Albert felt his knees go weak with relief, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "What conditions?" "Regular check-ins with my office. A full background investigation, which I assume will come back clean given your prominence in the business community. Counseling for both you and Viola to help process this transition. And if at any point I determine that this arrangement isn't in Viola's best interests, you'll remove her," Albert finished. "I understand." Linda reached into a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of papers. "These are the temporary guardianship documents. They'll need to be filed with the court within 48 hours. Do you have a lawyer?" "Several," Albert replied, accepting the folder with hands that shook slightly. "Good. Because this is just the beginning, Mr. Richardson. If Grace Washington's recovery goes well, Viola will eventually go home to her mother. If it doesn't..." Linda left the sentence unfinished, but Albert understood the implication. As they walked back toward the living room, Albert felt the weight of the papers in his hands like a talisman against an uncertain future. He had won this battle, but he knew that the war for Viola's welfare was far from over. They found Viola exactly where Albert had left her, sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the hallway where the adults had disappeared to decide her fate. When she saw Albert's face, her entire body relaxed with visible relief. "Ms. Morrison has some good news," Albert said, settling beside Viola on the couch. "You get to stay here while your mama gets better." Viola's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, transforming her entire face with joy and relief. "Really? I can really stay?" "Really," Linda confirmed, her professional mask softening into something approaching warmth. "But Viola, there are going to be some rules. You'll need to go to school, and there will be people who come to check on you and make sure you're doing okay. Is that all right with you?" "I like school," Viola said immediately. "I'm real good at reading, and I know all my numbers up to 100. Mama taught me." Albert felt a surge of pride at her eagerness to learn, her determination to be good and deserving of the chance she was being given. This child, who had been failed by so many systems, still believed in the possibility of better things. After Linda Morrison left, Albert and Viola sat together in the vast living room, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and painting everything in golden light. The legal documents lay on the coffee table between them like a bridge between their old lives and whatever came next. "Uncle Albert?" Viola's voice was soft with wonder. "Does this mean I'm really your family now?" Albert looked at this brave, resilient little girl who had somehow saved him just as much as he had saved her, and felt something in his chest expand with a warmth he'd forgotten was possible. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, pulling her close. "I think it does." Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success and happiness. But inside Albert Richardson's penthouse apartment, something miraculous had occurred. Two broken people had found each other and begun the slow, careful process of becoming whole again. The hardest part was over. Now came the even harder part, learning how to be a family. 6 weeks later, Albert stood in the doorway of what had once been his home office, watching Viola carefully arrange her new books on the shelves he'd had installed at her height. The transformation of the space was remarkable. Where once there had been leather-bound financial journals and corporate awards, now there were picture books and art supplies, a small reading chair in the corner, and drawings taped to the walls that showed stick figures labeled Uncle Albert, Mama, and Viola holding hands under a bright yellow sun. The drawings weren't the only thing that had changed. Albert himself looked different. The hard lines around his eyes had softened. His expensive suits had been joined by casual clothes suitable for playground visits, and there was a lightness to his movements that hadn't been there in 3 years. The penthouse apartment, once a sterile monument to success, now showed signs of life everywhere. Small shoes by the door, a child's jacket draped over a chair, the lingering scent of the pancakes they'd made together that morning. "Uncle Albert, look," Viola called out, holding up a book with obvious pride. "I can read this whole page all by myself now." Albert crossed the room and knelt beside her, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. In the weeks since Linda Morrison had approved their arrangement, he'd discovered muscles he'd forgotten he had, both physical ones from chasing Viola around playgrounds, and emotional ones from learning to put someone else's needs before his own daily responsibilities. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, genuinely impressed as she read through a paragraph with only minimal help. "Your mama is going to be so proud when she hears you read today." At the mention of Grace, Viola's face lit up with anticipation. Today was the day Grace Washington was finally being discharged from Chicago General Hospital, after 6 weeks of recovery from what the doctors had eventually diagnosed as a severe case of diabetic ketoacidosis complicated by pneumonia. The road back to health had been long and sometimes uncertain, but Grace had fought her way through it with the same quiet determination Albert had seen in her daughter. "Do you think Mama will like her new room?" Viola asked, gesturing toward the guest bedroom that Albert had converted into a comfortable space for Grace's continued recovery. He'd spared no expense: a hospital-grade adjustable bed, a private bathroom, a reading chair by the window that looked out over Lake Michigan, and fresh flowers that were replaced twice a week. "I think she's going to love it," Albert assured her. "But more than anything, she's going to love being with you again." The truth was more complicated than Albert let on. Grace's recovery had been physically successful, but the financial and emotional toll had been devastating. Her job at the cleaning company had been given to someone else after the first week of her absence. The tiny apartment she and Viola had shared had been lost when she couldn't make the rent. Even with the medical bills covered by a combination of Medicaid and Albert's quiet financial intervention, Grace was being discharged into a world where she had no job, no home, and no clear path forward. Which was why Albert had made a decision that still surprised him when he thought about it. "Viola, there's something I want to talk to you about before we pick up your mama," Albert said, settling into the small reading chair. "Something important about what happens next." Viola immediately picked up on the seriousness in his tone and came to sit cross-legged on the floor in front of him, giving him her complete attention in the way that only children could manage. "I've been thinking about your mama coming home," Albert continued carefully, "and I realized that this apartment is pretty big for just one person. Way too big, really. So I was wondering, how would you feel if I asked your mama if she wanted to stay here for a while? Not just to get better, but to be part of our family." Viola's eyes grew wide, and for a moment Albert worried that he'd overwhelmed her with the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Then her face broke into the kind of radiant smile that had become his favorite thing in the world. Really? Mama could live here too? Like for always? Well, that would be up to your mama to decide, Albert said cautiously. But yes, I'd like her to know that she's welcome here for as long as she wants to stay. Viola launched herself into Albert's arms with such enthusiasm that he nearly toppled backward in the small chair. As he held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling the fierce joy in her embrace, Albert marveled at how completely this child had rewired his understanding of what mattered. An hour later, they pulled up to the discharge area of Chicago General Hospital in Albert's Bentley, the same car where their story had begun 6 weeks earlier. But everything else had changed. Viola sat in a proper booster seat now, wearing a new winter coat and clutching a bouquet of flowers she'd insisted on picking out herself. Albert had traded his usual boardroom attire for jeans and a sweater, clothes that were better suited to the physical demands of life with a 5-year-old. Grace was waiting in a wheelchair just inside the hospital's main entrance, looking thinner than Albert remembered, but with color in her cheeks and strength in her posture that spoke of genuine recovery. She wore the new clothes Albert had bought for her, simple but well-made, chosen more for comfort than style. When she saw Viola through the glass doors, her face transformed with such pure joy that Albert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Mama!" Viola burst through the automatic doors and flew to her mother's side, careful not to jostle the wheelchair, but desperate to be close after weeks of limited visiting hours. "My beautiful girl," Grace whispered, her arms coming around her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had thought she might never hold her child again. "I missed you so much." Albert hung back, giving them space for their reunion, while handling the discharge paperwork with the efficient courtesy that had served him well in business. But even as he signed forms and collected medication instructions, his attention was focused on the mother and daughter who had somehow become the center of his world. The drive back to the penthouse was filled with Viola's chatter as she filled her mother in on everything that had happened during her recovery. Her new school, the friends she'd made in Albert's building, the way Albert had learned to make pancakes shaped like animals, the library visits and playground adventures that had filled their days. "And Uncle Albert got me my own bookshelf," Viola finished breathlessly. "And he reads me stories every night, even when he's tired from work. And sometimes he falls asleep in the chair, and I have to wake him up to tell him the story's over." Grace's eyes met Albert's in the rearview mirror, and he saw gratitude there that went beyond words. This woman understood that he had given her daughter more than just shelter and safety. He had given her stability, attention, and the kind of love that had allowed a traumatized child to bloom. "It sounds like you've been having wonderful adventures," Grace said softly, her hand stroking Viola's hair with the careful reverence of someone who had almost lost the right to such simple gestures. When they arrived at the penthouse, Albert watched Grace's face carefully as she took in the luxury of his home. He saw her eyes widen at the scale of the space, the expensive furnishings, the view of Lake Michigan that stretched to the horizon. But more than all, he saw wariness, the careful expression of someone who understood that accepting too much generosity could come with strings attached. Viola took her mother's hand and led her on an enthusiastic tour, showing off her room, the books Albert had bought her, the art supplies that had taken over half the dining room table. Grace followed quietly, taking in the evidence of her daughter's happiness and security, but Albert could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone prepared to run if necessary. It wasn't until they reached the guest room, now Grace's room, that she finally spoke. "Mr. Richardson," she said, turning to face him with the direct gaze he remembered from their first meeting in the hospital. "This is beautiful, and I'm grateful beyond words for everything you've done for Viola and for me. But I need to know what you expect in return." The question was fair, Albert realized, and one that Grace had every right to ask. In her experience, wealthy men who offered help to struggling single mothers usually had ulterior motives. She was protecting herself and her daughter in the only way she knew how. "I expect you to get strong and healthy," Albert said simply. I expect Viola to keep reading at least one book every day, because she's brilliant and shouldn't waste that gift. And I expect both of you to tell me if you need anything, whether that's medical care or help finding a job, or just someone to watch Viola when you need time to yourself. Grace studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read between the lines, looking for the catch that experience had taught her must exist. "That's all?" she asked. "That's all," Albert confirmed. "Well, that and maybe teaching me how to make those animal pancakes properly. Mine keep coming out looking like abstract art." For the first time since her discharge, Grace smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. Viola clapped her hands with delight at seeing her mother's happiness. "I can teach you pancakes," Grace said with a small laugh. "Though I have to warn you, mine aren't fancy. They're just regular pancakes made with love." "Those are the best kind," Albert replied, and meant it. Over the following days, a new routine emerged in the penthouse apartment. Grace took over much of Viola's daily care, but Albert remained deeply involved, driving Viola to school in the mornings before heading to work, joining them for dinner most evenings, and maintaining the bedtime story tradition that had become sacred to both him and Viola. The transformation in Grace was remarkable to watch. With proper medical care, adequate nutrition, and the security of knowing her daughter was safe and loved, she regained not just her physical strength, but her natural warmth and humor. Albert discovered that she was whip-smart, with insights about everything from child development to financial planning that impressed him more than most board presentations he'd sat through. More importantly, he discovered that she was exactly the kind of mother Viola deserved, patient, loving, and wise enough to let her daughter maintain the bonds she'd formed during their separation. "He's good for her," Grace told Albert one evening after they'd put Viola to bed. They were sitting on the terrace, looking out over the city lights, while sharing a cup of coffee. "I was worried that she might have trouble adjusting back to life with me, but you made sure she knew that loving you didn't mean loving me less." Albert set down his coffee cup, considering his words carefully. "I love that little girl," he said quietly, "but I never wanted to replace you. I wanted to make sure she had someone to count on while she couldn't count on you, and now that she can have you back, I want to make sure she doesn't have to choose." "What do you want, Albert?" Grace asked, using his first name for the first time. "Really? Because this situation, it can't go on indefinitely. People are going to talk, make assumptions. And Viola is going to start asking questions about why we're all living together like this." Albert had been thinking about the same questions, wrestling with the reality that their current arrangement, while working beautifully, existed in a kind of social and legal limbo that couldn't last forever. "I want whatever is best for Viola," he said finally. "If that means helping you get back on your feet so you can move out and rebuild your life independently, then that's what I want. If it means something else, then I'm open to that too." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying Albert's profile against the city lights. "What do you mean by something else?" Albert turned to meet her gaze, and in her eyes he saw the same careful hope he felt growing in his own chest. "I mean that this feels like a family," he said simply. "Not a conventional one, maybe, but a real one. I mean that Viola calls me Uncle Albert, but looks at me like I'm her father, and you feel like the missing piece I didn't know I was looking for." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and full of possibility. Grace reached across the small table that separated their chairs and took Albert's hand. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "And that terrifies me, because I've learned not to trust things that feel too good to be true." "What if it's not too good to be true?" Albert asked, his fingers intertwining with hers. "What if it's just true?" Their conversation was interrupted by the soft patter of bare feet on the terrace's stone floor. Viola appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep and her favorite stuffed animal tucked under her arm. "I had a bad dream," she said, looking between the two adults with the uncanny perceptiveness of childhood. "But then I remembered that both my favorite people are here, so everything's okay." Grace opened her arms, and Viola climbed into her lap, settling against her mother's chest with the boneless contentment of a child who felt completely secure. Albert watched them together, This woman who had fought her way back from the edge of death for her daughter's sake. This child who had refused to give up hope even in her darkest moments, and felt his heart expand with a love that was different from what he'd felt for Emma, but no less profound. "Mama?" Viola's voice was sleepy but thoughtful. "Uncle Albert? Are we going to be a family forever?" Grace and Albert exchanged a look over Viola's head, and Albert saw in Grace's eyes the same decision he felt crystallizing in his own heart. "What do you think about that?" Grace asked her daughter softly. "I think it would be perfect," Viola said with the simple certainty of childhood. "Like a story where everyone gets what they need. Have you ever found your family in unexpected places? Sometimes the people we're meant to love don't come to us in the ways we expect. What unexpected blessings have changed your life? Share your story with us. We'd love to hear how love found you." 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, Albert Richardson stood in the chambers of Judge Patricia Williams, wearing his best suit and the widest smile of his adult life. Beside him, Grace Washington looked radiant in a simple white dress that Albert had helped her choose, her hand steady as she signed the papers that would make their unconventional family legally official. Viola, wearing a new dress the color of violets and holding a bouquet of flowers almost as big as she was, bounced on her toes with excitement. "Do I call you Daddy Albert now?" she asked as Judge Williams pronounced them husband and wife. Albert knelt down to her level, his eyes bright with tears of joy. "You can call me whatever feels right, sweetheart." Viola considered this seriously for a moment, then threw her arms around Albert's neck. "I think I'll call you Daddy," she decided, "because that's what you are." As Albert held his daughter close, feeling Grace's hand on his shoulder and the judge's warm congratulations washing over them, he thought about the morning 6 months earlier when he'd been a different man. Successful but hollow, wealthy but empty, surviving but not truly alive. He thought about the bus stop where a little girl with a cardboard sign had changed everything. About the hospital room where he'd made promises he hadn't been sure he could keep. About all the small moments of courage and kindness that had led them to this perfect, impossible, completely true moment. The boardroom at Richardson Holdings had new family photos on the walls now, and Albert's assistant had learned to schedule meetings around school plays and parent-teacher conferences. The penthouse apartment echoed with laughter instead of silence, and Albert had discovered that the most important acquisitions in life couldn't be measured in dollars or market share. He had found his family in the most unexpected way possible, and in saving them, they had saved him right back. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright winter sunshine, Viola skipping between her parents with boundless joy, Albert realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not the aggressive pursuit of success, but the quiet contentment of being exactly where you belonged, with exactly the people you were meant to love. The little girl with the cardboard sign had been asking for a ride to her mother's hospital room, but what she'd really been asking for was someone to care enough to help. In giving her that ride, Albert had found his way home to a life he'd never imagined, but couldn't imagine living without. They were, all three of them, exactly where they were meant to be. Some families are born. Others are built, one act of courage and kindness at a time, by people brave enough to believe that love is stronger than circumstance, and that the most beautiful stories are the ones that seem too good to be true, but turn out to be the truest stories of all. Albert Richardson had learned that the greatest fortune isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. And in giving away his heart to a little girl at a bus stop and her remarkable mother, he had received riches beyond anything he'd ever dreamed possible. The millionaire who had found a girl alone at a bus stop holding a sign had discovered something more valuable than all his wealth combined. He had found his family, his purpose, and his way back to being fully, completely, joyfully alive. Their story was just beginning. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.